and verse 31. You'll notice in verse 30 it ends with Hezekiah prospered in all his works. Then verse 31, howbeit in the business of the ambassadors of the princes of Babylon, who sent to him to inquire of the wonder that was done in the land, God left him to try him, that he might know all that was in his heart. So, first of all, here we have God prospering Hezekiah, the high watermark of his life and ministry is really in this chapter. We're told earlier on that he was saved from his enemies, shepherded, enriched. He had this miraculous healing from terminal illness, highly regarded by all the other nations. And it's quite remarkable, especially when you consider where he began. He had a very wicked father, Ahaz, and he left Judah in a dreadful political and economic condition. But he sought the Lord and his righteousness, and God blessed him and brought him to this point. So God prospered him. But then secondly, here we notice God left him. You know the story here of Berodach Baladan sending letters, presents, ambassadors to Hezekiah to ask about this miraculous sign. And they came to honor him. And instead of rebuking them for their idolatry, he took them to God's house, he took them to his own house to show them all his treasure. So he didn't take them to God's house, took them to his own house, and basically became a show-off. Instead of taking the opportunity to show God off, he takes the opportunity to show himself off. And that's why it says here, in the business of the ambassadors of the princes of Babylon, who sent to him to inquire of the wonder that was done in the land, God left him. Very striking words. How do we understand these words? How can God leave a believer? Especially given the New Testament promise, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Maybe that didn't apply in the Old Testament. Well, we believe it did. So, how does this happen? Well, God can leave somebody in the sense of what's visible in their external providence. So, you've got all these visible evidences of God's presence with them for all these years, and then maybe God might leave him by taking away all these visible evidences of God's presence and favor. That's one way. Another way, though, is not so much external providence, but internal providence, where the influence of the Spirit on his heart is withdrawn, at least the felt influence of his Spirit. If you look at Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 5, section 5, there's one of the pastorally sensitive passages in the whole of the confession. It says, the most wise, righteous, and gracious God oftentimes leaves for a season his own children to manifold temptations and the corruption of their own hearts, to chastise them for their former sins, or to make known to them the hidden strength of corruption and deceitfulness of their hearts, that they might be humbled, and to raise them to a more close and constant dependence for their support upon himself, and to make them more watchful against all future occasions of sin, and then this lovely phrase at the end, and for various other just and holy ends. So there's some very clear reasons given, and yet the framers of the confession are also acknowledging there are reasons we just cannot enter into, we cannot be sure of, but we believe they are holy and just. And we believe this is what happened to Hezekiah here. He was left to the manifold temptations and corruptions of his own heart. God did not restrain this. God, as it were, took away the influence of his Spirit in that part of his soul. And the result was this pride. God left him. And we're told God left him to try him, to test him. So he tested Hezekiah really with prosperity. And he tested him also with this opportunity to witness to these heathen ambassadors. So he tested him to teach him that he might know all that was in his heart. God knew already, but he wanted Hezekiah to know. And it's like the sponge illustration. You can be looking at a bright yellow sponge. Is that what you call it over here? Thing you wash car with? Yeah. And it can look, perfectly clean. Then you squeeze it, and what comes out of it, if it's been sitting in a bucket of dirty water, then a bunch of dirty water comes out of it. And really, that's what happened here to Hezekiah. He was squeezed, he was tested, so that he would learn what was in his heart. And what did he find there? He found ingratitude, he found pride, he found idolatry, he found worldliness, he found man-pleasing, he found a love of praise, he found unbelief as well. And the result of it all was also that God chastised him, and not just him, the nation as well. Because he's told here, okay, you love Babylon so much. Well, you'll be glad to know that all you take pride in is going there. All that you've shown off is going to end up there. And Hezekiah's response is good as the word of the Lord. And this was not kind of some smug self-satisfaction. Well, it won't affect me. I'll escape scot-free. No, it was a spiritual sense of, well, God can bring good out of this, and he will. So God teaches using his word, using his Spirit, using sufferings, even using sin, to make us learn our weakness and lean heavily on the arm of the Almighty. Let's pray. O Lord, where would we be if we were right now left in this same way? What would break out even in this classroom? What would erupt in our lives? What would pour out of our mouths? Surely, O God, we would be utterly ruined in our reputation, even in our future ministries. And so we pray that we would not suffer in this same way as Hezekiah did, that we wouldn't be lifted up with pride and self-conceit and vanity and worldliness, but that we would be kept low, kept humble, kept needy, kept dependent, that we would know what is in our hearts without being shown in this humiliating and humbling way. We do pray, Lord, for help as we minister to those who may have a deep sense of being left. Maybe for some of these reasons, maybe there's other holy and just ends. Equip us in these sensitive, delicate matters. In Jesus' name, amen. So, the handout that we'll be using is under the lesson for depression. Sadness, I think, is the one that's put in Populi. Do you all have that okay? Okay. No, that was the bereavement one that we looked at. So I'm going to speak today primarily about adult depression. A lot of what I say will apply to teenage depression, even child depression, but it's important to recognize there are differences in some areas, and we will tackle this subject in much more detail in the next semester. We'll probably devote about 2 weeks to this subject, and one of the reasons is I believe that depression gives us a wonderful paradigm for dealing with multiple other problems and issues in people's lives. I think it gives us a model for dealing with other issues. Also because it will probably be one of the most common things that you come across in ministry if the statistics of society and the church are reflected in your own church. Now, anxiety and panic attacks are often associated with depression. And I'll be dealing with anxiety in a separate lecture next semester, but they are very tied together often, so much so that today many refer to depression, stroke, or hyphen anxiety. Depression, anxiety, because so much of what we can say about depression applies also to anxiety, and they often come very closely together. But we're going to try and follow our usual model of love, know, speak, do. In terms of loving, I think we have to recognize that it's often very difficult for those who have not been depressed to understand depression in others. And one of the greatest acts of love that we can offer to a depressed person is not to jump to conclusions about causes, and also to avoid extremes in deciding upon causes and cures. And this is often an instinct that some of us have to really fight against. It's amazing how much prejudice people come to the issue of depression with, often based on ignorance, but often based upon their own experience of one or two people with depression, and from that extrapolate to everybody. So we want to try, as an act of love, appreciate the complexity of depression and resist the temptation to propose simple analysis and simple solutions. Just as no two hearts are identically diseased, no two cancers are the same, so no two depressions are the same in cause, in symptoms, in depth, in duration, and in cure. The body, the soul, the thoughts, the feelings are very complicated entities. And the interrelation of these are even more complicated. So that unraveling the sequence of what went wrong in a depressed person's brain or soul or thoughts is often a humanly impossible task. Analysis of the mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual contributions to a situation is equally difficult. So what came first is difficult. The percentage of contribution from the spiritual, the physical, the mental, the social, equally difficult. Dr. Lloyd-Jones wrote that Christians don't understand how physical, psychological, and social and spiritual realms interrelate because Satan muddies the boundaries. Many of our troubles are caused because we think a problem is spiritual when it's physical, or we think a problem is physical when it is emotional or spiritual. Now, the Puritans were incomparable experts in soul care, but even they were well aware of the possibility of depression being caused by a physical element, a brain malfunction. William Perkins spent hours counseling people every week and carefully distinguished between melancholy with a physical cause requiring medicine and conviction of sin, which had a spiritual cause and required the blood of Christ. He said, "Sorrow that comes by melancholy ariseth only of that humour or sickness annoying the bodies. But this other sorrow ariseth of a man's sins, for which his conscience accuses him. Melancholy may be cured by physic or medicine. This sorrow cannot be cured by anything but the blood of Christ." In my little book, Christians Get Depressed Too, I warn against taking a physical only or a spiritual only or a mind only approach to depression. Often the causes are a mixture of all three. Perhaps the most common mistake in our circles, in Reformed Christian circles in general, is to say that all depression is the result of personal sin. I believe all depression is caused by sin in the sense that when sin entered the world, so did depression. But I strongly resist the idea that all depression is the result of personal sin, just as I resist the idea that all cancer is the result of a specific personal sin. I believe it can be. Personal sin can be a cause, even the cause of depression in a person, but we want to resist that being our default position when dealing with a depressed person, any more than it should be when dealing with a diabetic or a blind person. So I'm saying we don't rule it out, but it shouldn't be our starting point. It shouldn't be our default. As Reformed Christians, our default position should be that the most likely result, that it's the likely result of living as fallen creatures in a fallen world. That's the case when we deal with somebody with MS, with diabetes, with cancer, with autism, and so on. So why should our default position be any different when dealing especially with the most complex organ in our body? We cannot, Reformed Christians, believe that it is exempt from the effects of the fall. So I'm trying to emphasize right from the beginning a holistic approach to depression. We're made up, of course, of body and soul, but there's a third dimension, we might call it, that links, that overlaps these two elements, our thoughts and our feelings. Where do these come from? Well, it comes in that grey area. They come from a combination of the soul and the body. When our body is sick, even with the common cold, we recognize how it affects our emotional and our spiritual life. Our thinking and feeling processes go a bit awry in a limited manner, but in a noticeable manner. Similarly, when our spiritual life is in poor condition, if we are not reading, we're not praying, we're not using the means of grace, our thoughts and feelings are also affected. So it's no surprise that when our mental and emotional health is poor, that our thinking and feeling processes go awry. There are detrimental physical and spiritual consequences. The depressed believer can often not read or pray. She doesn't want to meet people, so she may avoid church and fellowships. She often feels God has abandoned her. So what about faith? Well, faith, instead of being a help, can sometimes cause extra problems in dealing with depression. When I speak of faith here, I'm speaking of being a Christian, being in the faith. For instance, there's the false guilt that can sometimes be associated with the false conclusion real Christians don't get depressed. And non-Christians don't have that extra dimension to consider. There's often the mistaken tendency to locate the cause of our mental suffering in our spiritual life, in our relationship with God, which often again increases guilt and feelings of worthlessness. As John Lockley said, being depressed is bad enough in itself, but being a depressed Christian is worse. And being a depressed Christian in a church full of people who do not understand depression is like a little taste of hell. As we all know, there is still quite an awful stigma attached to depression, and maybe especially in some Christian circles. Usually the result of misunderstanding of its causes, its symptoms, and its cures. And some of that misunderstanding is understandable. Unlike cancer, unlike heart disease, unlike arthritis, at least until very recently, there has been no scan. There's been no way of testing, no way of visibly demonstrating the existence of depression and anxiety. It's a largely invisible disease in that sense. We want to be able to point to something, a blood test, a scan, and say, there it is. There's the lump, there's the liquid, there's the chemical. And when we can't, we often conclude, well, it doesn't exist. There is no problem. Or, as Christians, we might wrongly conclude, my spiritual life is the problem. I think this makes us want to really pause before, again, doing that terrible jump of there is no test, therefore it does not exist. Some of this has already been made many Christians look foolish in recent years. For long enough, even the existence of schizophrenia has been really challenged and rejected, denied by Christians in the biblical counseling. You can even read somebody as wise as David Paulison saying some really foolish things about schizophrenia in his book, Seeing with New Eyes. He describes schizophrenics really as people who have never grown up, overgrown children. It's a horrible paragraph. And yet at the Biblical Counseling Conference just a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Charles Hodges spoke and admitted that current research is showing that there is indeed a physical cause to schizophrenia. There's a man in Nathan Eshelman's congregation in Los Angeles who is on the front line of world research into schizophrenia, and they have highlighted or isolated, I can't remember exactly, it's over 100 specific genes that are in the vast majority of schizophrenics' bodily makeup. So here we have schizophrenia, that was denied for long enough, and now we're beginning to discover some physical side to it. I think we need to be cautious rather than jump to conclusions and then we're made to look a bit foolish. In fact, let me just pause there. There was a video that came out yesterday that I think would be helpful here. I put it in my blog yesterday. This is a popular video, pitched at a popular level, just trying to do this really valuable work of informing the public in an accessible way about the latest science that has come out regarding depression.
But with over 350 million people affected by depression worldwide, it's no doubt an incredibly real and serious issue. But what exactly is going on inside of a depressed person? Is there a biological basis for these intense feelings of sadness? In the past, depression was often described as simply a chemical imbalance in the brain. Specifically, scientists believed that a lack of the neurotransmitter serotonin was to blame, which is often referred to as the feel-good chemical. However, the only real evidence for this was that when some depressed people were prescribed drugs which increased serotonin levels, it helped alleviate their symptoms. But while chemicals most certainly are involved, this view doesn't really capture just how complex depression is. In recent years, scientists began to notice that the brain cell growth and connections may actually play a larger role. When we look at the brain of a depressed person, studies show that the hippocampus tends to be much smaller than average. Brain are also physically affected, but this region in particular controls memory and emotion. And the longer a person has been depressed, the smaller the hippocampus becomes. The cells and networks literally deteriorate. It turns out that stress may actually be a main trigger in the decrease of new neurons in this area of the brain. In fact, studies have shown that when this region of the brain is regenerated and new neurons are stimulated, mood improves. Interestingly, many modern drugs, including those which affect serotonin levels, have an indirect effect on the growth of brain cells. This is likely why serotonin-based drugs seem to help some patients, but not for the reasons we once thought. Instead, they promote the release of other chemicals which ultimately stimulate neurogenesis or the growth of new neurons. Knowing this, some scientists now believe focus should be on drugs which directly affect neurogenesis. But while your neurons and chemicals may be the direct influencers, many genetic factors have been discovered as well. One particular study found that a variation in the serotonin transporter gene leaves individuals more vulnerable to depression. Every individual has 2 copies of the gene, one from each parent, and this gene can either be short or long. After tracking 800 young adults over 5 years, the study revealed that 33% of individuals with one short version became depressed after stressful life events, and people with 2 short genes fared even worse. On the other hand, those with 2 long genes were much less likely to become depressed with similar life stress. Many other genes have been identified which increase the likelihood of depression too, and it makes sense when you consider that depression and bipolar disorder both run in families. Studies of identical twins show that if one has bipolar disorder, the other has a 60 to 80% chance of developing it too. So while the true cause or causes of depression have yet to be pinned down precisely, and trust us, there's a huge list of other variables that studies suggest may come into play, it's important to remember that depression is a disease with a biological basis, along with psychological and social implications. It's not simply a weakness that somebody should get over, or even something that we have a say in. And just like heart disease or cancer, shedding light onto the subject is of the utmost importance in order to bring funding and proper research. But is depression only a human phenomenon? We look into the question, do dogs get depressed, in our
I think we
latest
can
ASAP
stop
Dog
it there.
video, and discover the many studies done to understand depression among other species, including your...
What?
So I was just getting interested.
I'm not a dog lover. I don't care if dogs get depressed. We would obviously, we would never say this proved depression is a physical. We don't go there. We recognize there are spiritual elements here too, and at times can be purely spiritual as well, but helpful balancing balance to us as well. So, want to try and avoid this prejudice coming to cases with our minds made up. Want to try and avoid unwarranted dogmatism. We want to study, we want to listen, we want to speak with humility and an awareness of our own ignorance and insufficiency when faced with these complex and often very mysterious causes. This can take a lot of time in listening, thinking through, prescribing a solution, working that through. There are not usually quick fixes, at least for serious depression. There will often need to be a balance in a Christian's life of various elements that go into a holistic cure. It can take many months. It can take even years. So great care is required, and want to just avoid dogmatism and avoid extremes. Let's move on to know. First of all, depression is very common. I've put the stats in your notes there. These are on the low end of most estimates. Some are talking much higher in terms of more in the high teens. But I think these are base level figures. 6% of men, almost 10% of women will experience a depressive episode in any given year. A lot here depends on what you describe as depression. Suicide, sometimes the end result of depression, is the leading cause of violent deaths worldwide, accounting for almost 50% of all violent deaths, compared with 18% in war, 30% by homicide. To me, that's just a startling and a shocking figure. Don't think we realize that. If you think of how much we pray about war, we don't do much prayer, do we, about this matter? And it's also common in professing Christians. The statistics are not that different. Indeed, it could be argued that today there's a bit of an epidemic of depression, anxiety, panic attacks amongst Christians. The stats are showing increased experience of this. And I don't think we should be too surprised either. It's something I think we should expect, given the increasingly depressing state of the church and of the nation. And so it's little wonder that Christians react adversely to these providences and get depressed and anxious about themselves and the world that they live in. Despite, however, it being so common, depression is not easy to define or identify. Whenever I go on a program or an interview about depression, I almost guarantee you, sum up depression in a sentence for us. And I always resist it. I don't think it can be done because it varies so much with age, with gender, with circumstances, with culture, and with personality. I have not found any two depressions alike. However, doctors, counselors, psychologists have compiled a list of common symptoms, the most common symptoms of depression, usually running to about 14 or 15 factors. You look up any internet site on depression, get any booklet on depression, you'll see these listed. And usually, the advice is if you have 5 or more of these for more than 2 weeks, then you are depressed. And the time factor is usually given to avoid classifying just temporary mood swings as a depression, because we all have these days, we all have these periods. I went home the other night from work and I just could not lift myself. I usually love going home, usually bright and breezy, looking forward to the kids, my wife, and nothing I could do. I just was as flat as a pancake, as we might say in Scotland. And went home the next night, felt just bright as a button and breezy, and I know it might be hard for you to imagine, but what explains that? My wife was asking me, what is wrong with you? And I have no idea. I just felt like there was just a cloud. So we want to avoid, I'm depressed, No, and sometimes that can go on. I'm sure we all have these days, even a week or two. But we're usually able, we pick ourselves up, or just different mood comes over us, and we go on with life again. Now, I personally like to think in terms of length, depth, and width of depression. In terms of width, we're talking about these 15 symptoms. So you imagine a range of these. They say 5. I'm looking more at 8, 9, maybe 10 before I'm really beginning to think depression. In terms of length, again, I'm not going to jump to depression usually after 2 weeks even of these symptoms. I'm usually thinking more in terms of a month or more. And in terms of depth, we're talking about the intensity of the feelings. Again, we're not going to call something depression that's just a dip, even in a number of areas, even for a length of time. There has to be a measure of intensity about them, often an incapacitating intensity, an overwhelming intensity. So what I would like to do here, instead of going through these 15 groups, I'm going to just highlight 5 areas, 5 interrelated areas of our lives that I usually try to explore with counsellors. I don't really like going through that list of 15 and ticking boxes. I like to just discuss these areas, which I think gather together these 12 to 15 symptoms or so in a more manageable framework. And the first is life situation. So life in this world has its ups and its downs. Our providence changes often rapidly from smooth and happy to rough and upsetting. And it's very important to recognize how providential changes can seriously damage our mental and emotional health. And so I'm talking here of things like bereavement, loss of a job, family difficulties, bankruptcy, health issues. So you might have somebody who has come to you just feeling really down, but has never linked these feelings with these life events. That's very common. I feel like this, I have no idea why. And so you begin to talk to them. Well, just talk to them about your life, and then you may say, have you had any losses? Have you had any pains? Any ill health? Any changes? And they begin to tell you, and you begin, well, no wonder you're feeling down. So we've got to take time to examine the lives of those we're counseling and try and trace the present depressed thoughts and feelings to events in our lives. And that can often be very painful. People have ways of shutting out the past, of breaking links, of being in denial. We all like to think of ourselves as strong, as self-sufficient, and we might look at events in our past and say, well, that was hard, but I pushed through that. And I'm not the kind of person that gets down like that. I can cope with everything that life throws at me. And so, especially with men, you get this reluctance to link depression to life situations because that makes me weak. That makes me frail. That means I'm not a coper. So often there's this desperate search for a physical cause. A purely physical cause, maybe a virus. As people search for this lack of well-being, they want to maintain this view of themselves as, I'm mentally strong, I'm a survivor, I'm a coper. Now, it may well be, and it may well be that no one of these events that people might start describing is enough in and of itself. But often there's the cumulative effect, and there is really literally a straw sometimes that breaks a camel's back. So people might come to you and say, well, this happened to me recently, but really, honestly, that's just such a nothing. That's happened to me many times in the past, and yet I seem to trace this downness to then. And you say, well, okay, that's a pretty small thing in and of itself, but then tell me about the last 2 years. And so they start telling you they lost a wife, they lost a father, they lost a job, they were in hospital, they've had children warring with one another, and they've had financial issues. And so you begin to hopefully try and show them, well, you can't just separate that, the last 2 years from the last 2 weeks. And yeah, this is a small thing at the end, but really you've been hammered for weeks, months, and even years here. And eventually, you've cracked. But don't look at just this one thing. Look at this broad range. So, want to look at life situation. You also want to look at thoughts, and maybe that's sometimes the most obvious symptom of depression, the very unhelpful thought patterns that tend to distort a person's view of reality in a false and negative way, thus adding to the depression and anxiety. And again, you've got a chicken and egg situation here. What came first? The negative thinking that caused the depression, or the depression that caused the negative thinking? And usually it's just very, very difficult to unravel that. The Bible does say in Proverbs 23:7, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So we are what we think in that sense. What we think will have a very defining impact on our mental, emotional, spiritual well-being. Now, we can't change the providences. We can't change the life events we're passing through, but we can change the way we think about them with God's help, so that we can have a more accurate and realistic view of our lives, thereby lifting our spirits. In my little book, I list 10 false thought patterns that reflect symptoms of depression, but also contribute to symptoms of depression. And I try to show examples of these thoughts in the lives of godly, biblical characters. I think it's really important to see how our thought patterns impact our ordinary life, and even more important to see how they're carried over into our spiritual life. So, You take, for example, false extremes. This is a tendency to evaluate personal qualities in extreme, in black or white categories. Shades of grey do not exist. It's sometimes called all or nothing thinking. So, for example, you might have a young mother. She makes a mistake in cooking a meal one night. She burns the pie and concludes, I'm a total disaster. I can't cook anything. Or a spiritual example might be you have a sinful thought when you're praying, an awful sinful thought, and you conclude, well, I cannot be a Christian. I must be an apostate. You can see it's taking one thought and running to an extreme with it. Very, very common in depressed people. False generalization. So here's someone that experiences an unpleasant event in their life and concludes, well, that's going to happen to me again and again and again. So, for example, a young man likes a young woman, makes a move to ask her out, to date her, and she gives him a knockback and concludes, well, that's always going to happen to me. I'll never marry anyone for the rest of my life. And of course, that's going to have a pretty depressing effect. Or, spiritual example, you try to witness to somebody, you end up totally mocked and belittled and humiliated, and you think, well, that's always going to happen to me, so there's no point in me ever trying to win a soul for Christ again. So you take one event and generalize from it going forward. False filter. When we're depressed, we tend to pick out the negative in every situation and think about it alone to the exclusion of everything else. This is very common after practice preaching. We filter out anything positive and decide everything is negative. So, for example, you get 90% on an exam. But all you can think about is the 10% you get wrong. This is something I have to fight against with my kids. You know, they come home, Dad, I get 92. My mind goes immediately to the 8. That's like the big 8 comes in the front of my mind. All I can think about is the 8. I didn't hear 92. All I heard was 8 lost points. But, you know, we can do that for ourselves as well. So, you know, you hear a sermon and you heard something you didn't like. The minister didn't put it the right way or you didn't agree with it. So what do you go home thinking about, talking about? Just that. You ignore everything else. So you develop this amazingly skillful filter that can filter out every good and positive thing, but lets through plenty of the negatives. False transformation. I'm just giving you 4 or 5 of these here. This is transforming a neutral or a positive experience into a negative one. So the depressed person doesn't ignore positive experiences sometimes, but disqualifies them or turns them into the opposite. So, for example, someone comes up to a depressed woman and says, hey, you're looking great today. And that woman immediately thinks, what's she trying to get out of me? You know, what's behind this? We could go on and on. I just recommend you read a couple of pages on that in my book. And I think what you'll find very helpful if you're raising children is you'll see these tendencies in some of your children. And it's very important knowing them to try and stop them early, try and change them early. One of my children is a very kind of negative thinker. Almost always comes home with a drama, a crisis, a problem. And so it's a battle every night to turn that around. Say, okay, tell us some good things, some helpful things, some happy things. And if you don't do that, then you're really building up vast likelihood of depression down the road. And of course, this also puts a huge responsibility on us as well, because all we're doing is critiquing our children and finding the wrong and crushing them continually and not recognizing good and achievements and success. you are developing a rut, a mental rut in their life that will impact them for the rest of their lives. Joel.
Just on that, I had a situation once where I was affirming my children and what they were doing positively, and I had a pastor tell me, don't affirm them in what they ought to do. Otherwise, they'll need praise the rest of their life.
Yeah. Well, we do need praise. I mean, that's how we're built. You know, yes, you can develop a dependency upon that, but just again, because we can go to an extreme doesn't mean we don't do a good thing.
I would agree.
Yeah. It's one of the things you recognize as you grow older. Maybe it's always there and you just see it more, but you begin to realize how much your parents' impact and influence and even determine the way you react and respond to things. It's kind of scary at times, even with the best of parents. And I know I'll do the same to my kids, no matter how good a parent I want to be. You'll find that a lot in counselling, so much, and it's not getting Freudian or anything, but so much is traced back to upbringing. And that's why you can be expecting an explosion of counselling as you go through your ministries compared to past generations because of the parenting crises in our society. So, thought patterns. Again, we're just dealing with this in a sort of shallow way at the moment. We will expand on this in the next semester. So, life situation, thoughts, feelings. So, depression is a sort of disease of the subjective, you might say. It's about unhealthy, damaging emotions and feelings. And if you've had lots of problems in your life, if you have developed these negative, false patterns of thinking, then you're going to feel pretty bad. You're going to feel pretty down pretty quickly. And so you want people to talk about their feelings, obviously. So a question might be, do you feel overwhelming sadness? Everyone feels sad from time to time, but depression-related sadness is overwhelming and long-term. For women, it often results in tearfulness and prolonged bouts of unstoppable sobbing. Often irrational. Like, why are you crying? I have no idea. No, really, there must be some cause. There is no cause. I just can't stop crying. Maybe things that used to give pleasure don't give pleasure anymore. The things they enjoy don't give any enjoyment. Maybe all they can think about is sins, mistakes, bad decisions that they have made. Do you feel overwhelming sadness? With a man, I'm going to ask this next question more. Do you feel angry all the time? Do you feel angry with God? Do you feel angry with others? And often, maybe the most common characteristic of depression in men is a and often irrational irritability and anger. Now, you won't often get men coming to you and saying, hey, I've got a real problem with anger, I might be depressed. But you will maybe get their wife or their children coming to you and saying, listen, my husband or my dad is just irrationally angry, he's bad-tempered, he's lashing out. And you follow that through, and in many cases it will be a symptom of depression. And of course a cause too, because this isn't going to make anyone feel better. After they've indulged in this, after they've let rip, then there's going to be huge guilt about that as well. Do you feel your life is worthless? So, in many cases, the person is highly valued by friends and family, viewed as very useful, making huge contributions, and yet the person feels none of this. They feel useless, they feel worthless. Indeed, often they feel their life is a burden. to other people, a blight. It really would be better if I wasn't here. I'm just a drag. Do you feel extreme anxiety or panic? This goes back to what I said in the opening. The authors of I'm Not Supposed to Feel Like This, which is an excellent book written by 3 Christians from the UK, one a doctor, one a psychologist, one a pastor, I think. They explain what happens when a person is overwhelmed by anxiety. In anxiety, the person often overestimates the threat or danger they're facing, and at the same time underestimates their own capacity to cope with the problem. Overestimates the danger, underestimates their ability to cope. Sometimes lasting only 15, 30 minutes, usually makes the person want to flee the situation and avoid it in the future. Do you feel God hates you and is far from you? Again, this person's life may be full of evidences of God's favor towards them. And yet they may feel God's my enemy. God hates me. The Bible's a dead book. Prayer is almost impossible. There's no sense of God's nearness. Do you feel suicidal, or do you have a longing to die? If you look at Spurgeon's exposition of Psalm 88, he speaks in there of his own depression, his own desire to die at times, similar to the experience of Heman in that psalm. Bodily symptoms. Well, the Bible confirms there is often a link between distorted thoughts and emotions and our bodily ailments. Proverbs suggests this: a merry heart does good like a medicine, but a broken spirit dries the bones. And every day, doctors are faced with people complaining of various physical symptoms whose root problems are their depressed thoughts or feelings. So people come, I can't sleep, I have no appetite, or else I'm overeating, and my weight's going up and down, usually up. Digestive problems, bodily pain, choking feeling, breathlessness. Some of these can be found in the Psalms as well, of lament. It's interesting, I don't know, somehow I ended up reading about Glenn Beck the other day. I'm not quite sure if I could find this, but anyway, apparently this guy has been desperately ill for the last couple of years, and really thinking he's going to die. And various, the most expensive varied tests in all the world were applied to him. Doctors could find absolutely nothing. Eventually come up with some kind of weird adrenal fatigue thing, but no evidence of it. And then he went into all sorts of various ways to cure this, and it ended up in some weird contraption in which he was enclosed in a sort of cage and spun around, and eventually he said this cured him. And when you read his life, what he was doing, he was awake 22, 23 hours a day, planning the Blaze and his TV network and all the books he was reading. This guy was depressed. It's as clear as day, what was wrong with this guy. All these bodily symptoms were the result of running himself and his mind into the ground in a short space of time. And I think the cure is largely psychosomatic as well. That somehow this quack has persuaded him that this thing will work. And I'm just waiting for the next collapse, because from what I can tell, he's not adjusted his life at all. So yeah, oftentimes you'll get people coming to you with a kind of complex of strange bodily issues, and they've been to all kinds of doctors, and there's just nothing doctors can put their finger on. I say, this is it. And I don't know what it's like over here, but this was often the case with people with ME, Do you have that over here, Emmy? Chronic fatigue syndrome or something like that. I can't even remember what ME stands for now. It was often called yuppie flu because it was often experienced by real high achievers. People always said you never found people with ME in the projects or the housing schemes, as it were. It was a kind of upper middle class disease. Now, there's no question in some cases there was probably a physical element, but again, in many cases it was depression. And never was anything found physically. It was usually somebody high achiever and unable to reach their goal, maybe in studies or in work, and eventually just kind of collapsed under the pressure and didn't want to face reality sometimes. And the last thing, though, that they would face up to was that it could be depression of some kind. They would try every single quack remedy in the book apart from an antidepressant. And it was a very difficult thing to face as a pastor. Often these people would go from church to church, and pastors would eventually kind of nudge them towards, well, have you thought of maybe seeing a psychiatrist? A psychiatrist, there's nothing wrong with my mind, And they would go off to the next church because, this pastor doesn't believe there's something physically wrong with them, and so on it went. So bodily symptoms, again, delicately, carefully, skillfully navigate this without ruling out that, there could be some glandular issue or whatever. Pushing somebody, nudging them to consider that there may be a mental and emotional element to this. And a spiritual element too. If you look at David in Psalm 32 and 51, it's clear that guilt broke his life and caused him severe physical symptoms. And then the fifth area is behavior and activity. So, obviously, if depression's impacting our thoughts and our feelings and our bodies, it's going to have an impact on what we do. And that's usually seen in two ways. First, in stopping doing things we enjoyed and starting doing things that are bad. So stopping things that are good for us, starting things that are bad for us. So people stop going to church, they stop going to fellowships, they stop contacting friends and family, they stop their hobbies, they stop their sports. Instead, they start staying indoors, drinking alcohol, watching TV non-stop, pushing people away who want to care for them. So these are the 5 groupings of these 5 areas where I would commend your focus in counseling people as you try and get to know their situation. Ask questions that will fill out each of these areas. Any questions before we go on, Craig?
Yeah, what was the behavior and activity again? Defining behavior or activity?
Yeah, just when you start seeing people stopping the things that they enjoy and that do good to them, and they start doing things that are bad for them and harmful, it's obviously a rational kind of behavior. Paul?
How much of fatigue is suggesting depression?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I probably had a bad experience with a number of people. But what always struck me was the utter refusal to consider this. When people are open to considering something, then, you kind of have hope, there's an openness, there's willingness. But the people that I was dealing with were not going there. That's just not me. And so now, some of them 30 years on are still, their life is gone, it's finished and it's over. Phil?
Under feelings where it says, do you feel your life is worthless? Obviously, we don't want the counselee to feel that their life is completely worthless and that they are right. But at the same time, we don't want to necessarily encourage them to be overly prideful. Where's the proper balance?
Yep, sure. I'll come to that a bit. We'll deal with self-esteem later in terms of trying to build a person up again. And it can be a a difficult balance to get, but there's nothing wrong with telling somebody, well, look, your family love you, your friends love you, and you've got talents and gifts in this area. So you're not sort of telling them, you're a good person and you're worthy of salvation and things like that, but you're just, it's not positive thinking, but it's realistic thinking. You're trying to give them a realistic assessment of God's gifts to them in common and hopefully as well spiritual grace. So let's just briefly touch on a couple of areas of speak. And again, a lot of this will depend on what we've discovered in previous areas. But again, if I can give you the main areas to address, first of all, speak about stress. Oftentimes you'll have found out things in their life, stress events, as it were, stress lifestyles. And so you've got to start talking about this. I often find it useful to talk about an elastic band. So you stretch a piece of elastic, a rubber band, and sometimes to 2 and even 3 times its size. But the more you stretch it, and the longer you hold it stretched, the greater the danger of the rubber fraying, stretching, and eventually snapping. And we're all stretched from time to time. You're being stretched very much here at seminary. And there can be a strengthening impact of that, in that if you survive it, then it's good for the future. You've chosen to be stretched. You've come here and you've made a choice. There are other situations where people don't have a choice. Life happens, events happen, they've got no control over them. And but we've got to try and distinguish between these two stretches. One, which is our choice, and one, which is that we have no control over whatsoever. So try and split this up, first of all, into life events or lifestyle. So life events include things like marriage. You may say, well, surely that's a choice. Well, many times it does just happen as well. Relocations, the two most stressful events are marriage and moving, they say. Exams, bereavement, illness, unemployment, birth of children. All of these life events put a strain upon us to one degree or another. And when that stretch happens, just as it changes, any stretch changes the composition of the band, the rubber, so our body and our chemistry changes. When we are under stress, chemicals start getting produced that do not get produced when we're in a more relaxed state of mind. And again, that's good and that's necessary as part of God's provision so that we can perform in peak situations and to peak levels. And usually after such an event, a life event, our chemistry, our body, our moods, our thoughts return to normal. But sometimes these stressful events can occur over a lengthy period of time. Or they can come one on top of another. So you might have a child with a terminal illness. There's a long period of illness. Or you can have a series of things happen. You lose your job, you lose your home, you lose a good friend, your mother dies. And the result is that the extra strain for an extra period of time changes our bodies and our chemistry more permanently. They don't return to normal as easily. We can't just pick ourselves up, no matter how many people urge us to. And in the worst case scenario, the band breaks, snaps. We used to speak in the old times of nervous breakdown. Maybe we speak today about burnout. And it's like, the computer, you're operating, 2 or 3 programs open, everything's going well. You start opening 20 and 25 and 30, then eventually you cause a crash. The machine will shut down, and so it is with ourselves. So you've got life events that we don't have much, if any, control over. But secondly, there's lifestyle. And these are things we do have control over. The proportion of time and energy we give to work, to socializing, to shopping, to traveling, to exercise, to rest, to sleep. These are all choices. And I would say that, not just much, but most depression that I come across today is the result of people choosing to live an imbalanced lifestyle. They're working too hard, they're spending too much, and on the other hand, exercising, resting, and sleeping too little. Again, sometimes you've got to go through periods of this, like in the last few weeks of a semester. But we're talking here not so much about a reaction to external events you have little or no control over, but these are longer term choices. So you've got the man who's working, 15, 16, 18 hours a day for months, if not years at a time. You've got the woman at home who's working to keep this perfect family and this perfect house and this perfect everything, so that there is no downtime, there's no rest. There's just, from the moment she gets up till the moment she goes to bed, it's just 100% go, and so on. That's what I mean by a lifestyle. You've got to talk to people about that. Use the elastic band illustration often. Use the fuel illustration. We've all got limited fuel. And we can either, pour it all out in a few years or months, or we pace ourselves and make sure we refuel as we go along. People understand these pictures. So we want to speak to people about stress. We want to speak to people about psychology, or the way you think. Now, many Christians wouldn't think of viewing God's word in a false way, but think nothing of viewing God's world in a false way. And many Christians do that. They view themselves, their relationships, in a wrong way, in a negative way, in a way that magnifies negatives and ignores or excludes the positives, and that distorted view of reality inevitably depresses the mood. So Christians are obliged to challenge falsehoods and distortions of reality, especially when they find them in themselves. And next week when we come together, we'll go through Psalm 77 as a way, as a model, as a template of challenging false thinking, a false view of reality. That's what the psalmist does there. He builds up this wrong view of reality. He then recognizes what he's done, and he brings God's word to change and challenge these thoughts that are producing such feelings. And we'll leave it there today. We'll go on to speak about sin, speak about sickness, speak about sovereignty. And under do, next week we'll go through that Psalm 77 as one of the therapies, as it were, for dealing with depression. Any last questions before we wrap up? Okay, well, let's leave it there today. Katola, would you lead us in prayer?
Gracious Lord and Heavenly Father, we thank you once again for this day. Thank you, dear Lord, for this privilege of coming here and learning not only about your word, but how to pray, dear Lord, that I know we've looked at a very challenging topic today. We pray, Lord, that we may look at it from the vantage point of your word, that we may study it and do our best to understand it so that we may be helpful in helping those you will bring into our path. Please be with us this day, dear Lord. Please be with us over this weekend. Please keep us safe on the roads, even in this weather that we're experiencing, and help us go to church on Sunday ready to worship you. For we pray asking all this in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen. You probably all think you're depressed now, don't you? That's one of the problems when you start studying counselling. You think you've got everything. You think, oh, I'm that, and I'm that, and I'm that. I'm a total wreck.